All right, let's dive straight into this explainer because what's happening to the European auto industry right now? It's nothing short of an unprecedented historic crisis. We are literally watching legacy giants, the very companies that essentially built the modern industrial world, facing an existential threat that is completely rewriting the rules of global trade.
I mean, take Volkswagen stock, for example. It's plummeted 65% over the last 5 years. 65%. It doesn't even look like a 90-year-old industrial titan anymore. It honestly looks more like a crypto token that just crashed. And what's truly wild here, it's actually cheaper right now than it was during the massive Dieselgate scandal, a time when the company was quite literally caught lying to regulators for a living. Somehow, the situation today is even worse.
So, to survive this, Volkswagen is considering doing the unthinkable, breaking a 90-year taboo to cut up to 100,000 jobs and close 4 German factories. This completely shatters a written job security promise they made to their own unions. They guaranteed no plant closures until 2030, and now they're breaking that guarantee in just 80 months. It really goes to show that a corporate promise from a major manufacturer has a remarkably short shelf life today.
Now, if you go and ask European politicians why this collapse is happening across heavyweights like VW, BMW, and Mercedes, they're going to confidently point you to three main culprits. They'll tell you it's all about high energy costs, an aging workforce, and, endless red tape and bureaucracy from Brussels. And sure, those structural issues, they're absolutely real, but focusing on them completely ignores the actual root cause. Blaming red tape is a bit like asking a guy why his house burnt down, and he gives you this highly detailed lecture on the flammability of his curtains, completely ignoring the dude standing on his front lawn holding an empty gas can. If we break down the numbers from Bloomberg on Germany's recent GDP shortfall, all that red tape and weak demand, it only explains a tiny 20% fraction of the problem. A massive 40% is from the energy shock, absolutely, but that remaining 40%, that is lost export markets. The real issue here is a sudden, massive loss of buyers, simply because China has stopped buying what Europe makes. For decades, Germany ran the perfect textbook trade surplus economy, build incredibly complex, expensive machines, and sell them to China. But that relationship has flipped so dramatically today that the EU is now running a trade deficit with China of roughly 1 billion euros every single day. Just wrap your head around that scale. This perfectly illustrates a phrase I absolutely love from economist Adam Tooze. He calls this mercantilist on mercantilist violence, basically a heavyweight clash between two export-obsessed economies. For 100 years, German car makers just assumed their advantage in building combustion engines was totally permanent. But the forced transition to electric vehicles rendered that advantage obsolete practically overnight. So how exactly did China gain such an insurmountable edge? Well, you have to look at what the industry calls China's speed. Traditional European and US automakers usually run product development cycles of, say, 40 to 80 months. Chinese firms, they can launch a brand new car in under 24 months. They manage this by using super flat management structures and essentially treating cars like smartphones. They ship the vehicle fast and just fix any bugs later with over-the-air updates once you're already driving it. Zooming out to the macro level, this all builds into a massive economic shift that experts are calling China Shock 2.0. Now, unlike the first China Shock back in 2001, which wiped out low-wage manufacturing like cheap toys, China is now 18% of global GDP. And today, they're exporting roughly 10 million advanced vehicles because domestic sales at home have crashed. They're dropping this massive surplus directly into the technology-intensive sectors that Europe used to completely dominate. Now, impartially speaking, a massive surge in exports like this should normally trigger natural market corrections, right? Like the country's currency going up in value. But economic experts like Michael Pettis and Brad Setzer point out that China avoids these standard corrections. Instead of rising, the renminbi has depreciated by about 15%, and state banks routinely buy dollars to keep it artificially cheap. They're essentially pushing these immense trade imbalances directly onto everyone else's books. What's really fascinating here is the math. And honestly, the sheer futility of it is staggering. VW's agonizing plan to fire 100,000 workers, it saves them just 1,000 euros per car. But get this, that is completely dwarfed by the massive 6,000 to 15,000 euro cost advantage that Chinese EVs hold right out of the factory. Firing the workforce isn't curing the disease at all. It barely even treats the symptoms. And you know what? Corporate executives can't even blame EV fatigue. that might be a popular narrative over in the US, but in Europe, with super strict emissions quotas and gasoline that's 70% more expensive than in the States, drivers are actively buying electric cars to escape those high fuel costs. The problem isn't that they stopped buying EVs, they're just buying Chinese cars that feature voice-controlled AI and can charge from 0 to 70% in literally 5 minutes. So, when Brussels tried to fight back by restricting their EV subsidies to locally assembled cars, Chinese manufacturers instantly found a brilliant loophole. It's basically a 3-step playbook. The EU offers subsidies for local assembly, Western automakers abandon their large factories to cut costs, and then Chinese brands just swoop right in. They take over the empty plants and do final assembly there to claim the European subsidies paid for by European taxpayers. We're literally watching the industrial furniture get swapped out in real time. Just look at this lineup. You've got Chery moving into Nissan's Barcelona factory, Geely taking over a Ford plant near Valencia, BYD is in talks for VW's famous glass-walled Dresden factory. Stellantis is even building cars for China's Dongfeng inside their very own historic plant. This hands Chinese rivals instant local legitimacy, access to supplier networks, and a perfectly legal way around EU import tariffs all in one fell swoop. There's this quote from Union Rep Philippe Guilleron that perfectly captures the tragic reality of these joint ventures. He says, "It's as if somebody started cooking your meals for you all the time. In the end, you no longer know how to cook for yourself." Which hits the nail on the head, right? Once your cars run on Chinese software, Chinese batteries, and Chinese architecture, you are no longer a manufacturer, you're just a marketing department with a familiar legacy badge on the hood. So how exactly is Europe defending itself? Well, right now, analysts are calling it a leaky bucket trade defense, and the timeline is almost comical. Month 1, the EU slaps duties on Chinese battery EVs. Month 2, Chinese battery EV sales slow down. Month 3, imports of Chinese hybrids into Europe suddenly surge 155% overnight. The EU is basically trying to play whack-a-mole with one product line at a time, which is like trying to bail out a flooded basement with a teaspoon. In a bit of a panic, some leaders have proposed basically building a giant wall, a flat 30% tariff on all Chinese imports. But history throws up a massive red flag here. Just like we saw with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in the 1930s, which actually deepened the Great Depression, this risks a severe beggar-thy-neighbor spiral. Building a giant wall doesn't necessarily keep the trouble out, it just locks everyone inside with a shrinking economy. To avoid repeating that catastrophic mistake, economists are proposing a much more surgical tool, a European version of America's Section 301. Instead of fighting over single products like truck tires or electric cars one by one, this trade tool would allow Brussels to investigate and respond to economy-wide systemic macroeconomic distortions. They could actually target the persistent currency undervaluation that creates the flood of cheap goods in the first place. But here is the absolutely crucial point to remember. Even perfectly targeted tariffs cannot override basic accounting. A trade deficit simply means a country is consuming more than it produces and saving way too little. If you throw up a tariff wall, you haven't magically touched that underlying domestic imbalance. You just force the local consumer to pay a whole lot more money to sustain it. So, what does this crisis with Volkswagen and the broader auto industry truly represent? It's the sudden, violent end of a 30-year era of global efficiency, and it's pushing the entire world toward autarky. Now, if you're not familiar, autarky is basically an economic system of self-sufficiency, motivated mostly by fear. It means nations are prioritizing redundancy, duplication, and closed supply chains over cost efficiency. Stretching a supply chain across an ocean just to save a few cents? Yeah, that era is officially over. Governments and corporate boardrooms have essentially looked at their exposed delivery routes and decided, you know what? Global integration is just no longer worth the strategic risk. Because of this, we are moving into a deeply inefficient, much higher cost reality. The new era of global trade means redundant, duplicate plants, trading mostly with political allies, much thinner margins for businesses, and inherently higher prices for consumers. So, as we watch 90-year-old giants like Volkswagen falter and scramble to survive in a world they used to completely dominate, the ultimate takeaway for all of us boils down to this one provocative question. Are we really prepared to pay a permanent, high-cost premium on almost everything we buy for the rest of our lives, simply for the comfort of keeping the gates of global trade closed? It's a massive shift, guys, and the bill, well, it's just starting to arrive.